He was the warrior who united divided empires, the strategist who humbled Crusaders, and the leader who earned the respect of both enemies and allies. But who really was Saladin? Behind the sword and the legend lies a story you've never heard. It's time to talk about one of the greatest warriors in history, Saladin al-Ayyubi. And no, not that Saladin. This is the guy who actually created the Crusader states. But his story doesn't start there. He was born in 1137 or 1138 in what is now called Tikrit, which is a city in Iraq. Its original name wasn't even Saladin. It was Salah al-Din Yusuf bin Ejib, so Saladin was actually a nickname. Literally means the Knight of Justice. The story goes that he got that moniker because when he was a young warrior, he helped an old woman who had been wronged by some bandits. Didn't need to do it, but he did it anyway. But it's probably more likely that the nickname came from Saladin's staunch adherence to Sunni Islam. Saladin's father died when he was very young and his mother remarried. Her new husband was named Naim al-Din, which literally means the brightness of the faith, and was a Kurdish Muslim knight. So not only was Saladin's stepson, he was also kind of an honorary Kurd too. By the time he was a teenager, Saladin had already developed a reputation as a skilled swordsman. In 1154, while he was still a teenager, he went on pilgrimage to Mecca. Then he returned to Baghdad and joined the army. Around this time, the Zengid dynasty controlled much of the Middle East. They were originally Turkish and were trying to expand their domain into Mesopotamia. Saladin fought alongside them in battles against the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. Soon, he rose through the ranks, became a trusted general of the Zengid Sultan, Nur al-Din Mahmud, and a close friend of the Sultan's son, Al-Adil. When Nur al-Din Mahmud died, his son took the throne, but he died a year later, and without any heirs. So Saladin seized power in 1174. He was now the ruler of a vast realm that stretched from Anatolia, in modern Turkey, all the way to Yemen and southwest Arabia. But he was constantly at war. There was the Byzantine Empire to the north, the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the southwest, and a bunch of other Muslim states that wanted a piece of his kingdom. To make matters worse, Saladin had made powerful enemies in the person of Louis VII, King of France. In 1162, Louis sent his son to participate in the Second Crusade. That son was named Louis II, and he was only 17 years old when he arrived in the Holy Land. Naturally, he spent his time there carousing with the local nobility rather than fighting Muslims. Naturally, he ended up getting killed by an arrow while relieving himself in a latrine. Now, though it's unclear if the arrow was fired by a Muslim soldier or a crusader, as far as Saladin was concerned, it didn't matter. He blamed Louis for coming to the Holy Land in the first place, and said if Louis VII ever set foot in the region again, he would kill him with his own hands. Louis eventually did return to the Holy Land, and Saladin did kill him. But that was a few decades later, after Saladin had already conquered Jerusalem and established himself as one of the most powerful men in the region. But Saladin still had to deal with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. See, this was the big problem with the Crusader states. They were too small. Just look at this map. Here's the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the middle of the Levant, and here's the rest of the Muslim world. At its largest, the Kingdom of Jerusalem controlled a tiny slice of Palestine, a little bit of Transjordan, and a couple tiny slices of Syria. The Crusader states needed to grow, or else their subjects would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of hostile Muslims surrounding them. But how were they supposed to do that? Well, the solution was simple. All they had to do was conquer Egypt. Now, the problem with conquering Egypt was that Egypt was ruled by the Ayyubids, and the Ayyubids were led by none other than Saladin. Should mention that Saladin had ambitions beyond just the Levant too. He wanted to unite the entire Muslim world under his rule. He was especially interested in reviving the Abbasid Caliphate, though it was mostly a symbolic revival, since the Caliph would have little real power. Still, to do that, he needed to conquer Mecca and Medina. But to get there, he had to go through Egypt, which belonged to the Crusaders' allies. So war was inevitable. In 1182, Saladin invaded the county of Tripoli. That was a Crusader state located along the Syrian coast. Saladin defeated the Crusaders at the siege of Montferrat. Then he turned around and marched on Damascus. There he faced off against the armies of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. The two sides met at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin in July of 1187. It was a decisive victory for Saladin. And in the aftermath, Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem. The Crusaders surrendered on July, and Saladin entered the city as a conqueror. Now this is where Saladin becomes the stuff of legend. You see, when Saladin seized Jerusalem, he gave the inhabitants a choice. They could either convert to Islam, in which case he would spare their lives and give them a noble title and half their wealth, or they could leave the city and take their wealth with them. In fact, he even offered to help them resettle elsewhere. Of course, the Crusaders could fight to the death, but Saladin knew that would only result in bloodshed. And bloodshed went against his personal philosophy. Here's the thing. Most people think of Saladin as a ruthless killer, and he certainly was a capable warrior, and he was responsible for the deaths of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Crusaders. But he wasn't just some bloodthirsty warmonger. He genuinely believed that he was bringing justice to the region. He hated the Crusaders not because they were Christians, because they had seized Jerusalem and were preventing Muslims from accessing the city, and Saladin was nothing if not devout. In fact, his record as a firm-minded, generous, and honorable ruler is so legendary that European chroniclers from the time period wrote about it. When Raymond of Aguilers wrote about Saladin, he said that God had sent him as a punishment to the Christians for their sins. Another French chronicler described Saladin as a most valiant and wise knight and a man of great honor and of such courtesy that both Christians and Muslims agreed that he was one of the best men of his age. Christian captives often found themselves in his debt. Once he saved the life of a knight named Gerard de Rideford, who insulted Saladin and called him a heretic while they were in the same cage together. Saladin released Gerard and even gave him a noble title and half of his wealth, because he had seen Gerard praying and felt that he was a good man despite his religious differences. And Saladin wasn't just magnanimous to prisoners. During the siege of Acre, which took place from 1189 to 1191, Saladin allowed ships carrying women and children to leave the city. And when Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, fled down there, Saladin let him escape without executing him. Saladin even showed mercy to fellow Muslims who opposed him, such as the Caliph of the Zenjad dynasty, who had tried to prevent Saladin from seizing Jerusalem. Instead of killing him, Saladin forced him to watch as Saladin paraded through Jerusalem in front of the city gate. So yeah, despite being called Sal the Destroyer, Saladin was a pretty cool guy, or at least he could be. He wasn't perfect, of course. For example, Saladin executed captured rebel soldiers and entire families that supported the Crusaders. But even his enemies respected him. When the English king, Richard the Lionheart, arrived in 1191 to try to retake Jerusalem, Saladin was ready for him. Richard was able to capture Acre, but his attempts to advance further were thwarted by Saladin's forces. Eventually, the two leaders met at the siege of Arsef. It was a massive battle between the Crusaders and the Ayyubids, but ultimately the Crusaders won. And Richard continued his march south until he reached Jaffa. There he met with Saladin again. This time peace talks succeeded, and Richard was allowed to ransom the rest of the Crusader prisoners for 10,000 pieces of gold. Then Richard left the Holy Land, and Saladin was left in control. As the Muslim world, Saladin accomplished exactly what he set out to do. He rescued Jerusalem from the Crusader and re-established Muslim control over the city. He also prevented the Crusader states from expanding their territory in the Levant. In fact, he actually expanded his own territory quite a bit. He controlled most of Syria, all of Egypt, and Mesopotamia. At one point, he even briefly controlled the Kingdom of Hungary. But Saladin never forgot about the Abbasid Caliphate. He brought it back to prominence and served as the wali, or deputy, of the caliph. Unfortunately, Saladin died in 1193 of an illness, possibly malaria, but he left his empire in good hands. His brother Al-Aziz Uthman ibn Alu succeeded him and continued the dynasty for another century. If you like history and tech stories, be sure to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.